3, 2, 1, live.
Great, they got to see my bald.
They got to see Mark's bald. Would you stand up and focus in on Mark's bald head? Being a product of the 70s and loving the, sit down. Watching the Muppet Show all the time, I love the two old men that were up in the balcony that would heckle. So I think of John often. He's up there giving me hand signals. 5, 4. It's like he's that heckler up there. I'm glad to see you out tonight. I'm glad to be here. We're in Isaiah chapter 9. We are lightning fast through this book. Normally I'm here at the building, for me, I'm here at the building at say 5 till 7. I show up at about 6, 7 after. I was wondering if Lee was sweating thinking, I've got Isaiah tonight. I'll get my glasses on where I can see. Woohoo! 57. Chapter 9. And let me clarify something. I've already been asked to go for another quarter, so you got me.
We're talking years, not quarters. It was either that or chapters 11 through 66 in 1 week.
If you're out in TV land and you can't hear all this, come on back in so you can enjoy it. Yeah. I've got thick skin, broad shoulders. I did turn the air on. It's starting to cool off in here, so good. I can't remember exactly what verse we finished on, but we're going to start on verse 8. That's a good place to start. The Lord sent... I bought real prescription glasses and I don't like them, so now I'm wearing the $5 ones from that store up the street. The Lord sent a word against Jacob, and it has fallen on Israel, and all the people will know, Ephraim and the inhabitant of Samaria, who say in pride and arrogance of heart, the bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with hewn stones. The sycamores are cut down, but we will replace them with cedars. Therefore the Lord shall set up the adversaries of reason and against them, and spur his enemies on, the Syrians before and the Philistines behind. And they will devour Israel with open mouths, for all of his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. The bricks have fallen down. Instead of using 2 slides, I was conserving paper. That's funny, guys. There's no paper. It's all electronic. I've conserved a lot of paper. What bricks have fallen down? What's our reference here? What's going on? Let's get back up to speed. It's been a week since we were studying this.
The word that has come against them is that God is going to judge them, and there's going to be desolation and destruction of their cities. And so now we've got the people sitting here going, okay, well the cities, the walls have been knocked down, our buildings have been destroyed. That's okay, we'll overcome it.
Okay. Lee gets real technical about it. The word has come. The Assyrians have come in, and whether it's future tense or past tense, I don't know if they're saying, we've heard the word and this is what's going to happen. God's brought judgment. The northern kingdom is being wiped out. Their friends, their brethren, their family members, they're being wiped out, going to be wiped out. Hard times are coming. The bricks have fallen down. Their houses are in disrepair. This utter destruction. But what's really the problem? Because normally we do rebuild. We're in an area, we get hit by a hurricane. It hurts for a few days, a few weeks, a month or year. But you rebuild. So what's really the issue going on here? And Lee can't answer it.
They see themselves above God's judgment. They're, out of their own ability, they'll rebuild, even though it's God that brought it down.
Yeah, so I see the word "we" there. It's pride and arrogance.
And that's what Joanne's saying. And that's the thing. Not only that, the first time I read through, I thought about the hewn stone, which took me back to years ago. Leah had sermons about taking an altar, and God didn't want hewn stones. He wanted natural stones. And that's where my mind first went. And that's not, there could be something in there, but that's not the we. But what has been one of the problems? There's a few words that come up, and I think that Joanne, you hit them about every time. What is God's nature, personality? What's this book about? Or one of the themes in it? And it's kind of that legal courtroom. Justice, judgment, equality. Not only is it let us, or we're going to rebuild, because they're not putting faith or confidence in God. But they're not rebuilding the same way that they were. They're going to step up. We had bricks. We had clay bricks. Now we're going to get cut stone. Moving on up. Oh, that's a Jefferson.
It's sycamores, and now we're going to have cedars.
We're going to get the best trees. Hadn't there already been a problem where those that were in good position had been oppressing those that were in lower positions? Hadn't there been an issue where their own people in the southern kingdom in Judah had been taken advantage of and not having justice for or equality in their laws for all? So you see, there's several things going on. For the word sent, like Lee said, God has sent word. This is what's going to happen. It's already happened to Israel. It's coming to us. We're just going to rebuild with no clue as to the reason that they were destroyed or are going to be destroyed is because of their disobedience. And they've still not learned a lesson where they're still, it's us, we're going to do it. Okay, you may speak.
Thank you. It's not the issue of the houses. It's not the issue of the walls. The issue is who's your king. And so they're basically accepting conquest. That's okay. We can build back. We can build back better than we had before. And we can improve on this, but we're going to be subject to the Assyrians now. When in fact, God gave you himself as a king, and you've rejected it. So the physical homes, the physical cities are not the issue. They're missing the point.
Missing the point. And that's a lesson that we have to be very careful today, that we don't miss the point. And as he keeps going on through this, the Lord's going to set up the adversaries. But I want you to look in, and we've alluded to it, but look in verse 12. There's a description of the way in which they're going to be devoured with open mouth. I don't know about you, but I can't read that without having this the gnawing. This isn't a polite, civilized dinner where your pinky's up and you eat quietly with your mouth closed. But this is a ravenous animal with no... Oh, my brain went blank. I know that's hard to believe. No couth, no... What am I looking for? There is no... Decorum, no manners, no civilization whatsoever. This is uncivilized. For all of this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. I think this was left over from last week, and I didn't allude it or delete it, and it may have should have come first or what, but God has come to rebuke. The New Testament teaches us about rebuke, correction. Paul writes to Timothy. Old Testament is full of all kinds of passages about how to receive the chastisement of the Lord. And that's a hard lesson for any of us to learn. But what are the two options when it comes to rebuke and correction? There's only two in my mind.
Accept it or reject it.
You either follow God and obey, come back to Him, or you harden your heart and you go further away from Him. And that's, you turn to God or you harden your heart. And over and over and over, God has begged, come back. Come back. we really, when I say we, that's a very generic, not we, you and me, but the world needs to understand that the message of God from the beginning of time is, I want a people. That's all he's ever wanted. He wants a people to call his own. And we, in our ignorance, our stubbornness, our arrogance, continually run from him, and he repeatedly. Now, for in his anger, or for all of his anger is not turned away. Can anybody paraphrase that? I mean, that's pretty. The for all his anger. What's the SV say?
For all this, his anger.
For all this, his anger is not turned away. I don't like the wording, but it doesn't matter what Craig likes. That's what it says. You would think, kind of like a parent, well, for all that he's done, the kids aren't coming back. The kid, the child, Judah is doing stupid stuff, and he's saying, for all this, his anger is not turned away. But his hand has reached out still. What does his hand has reached out still mean?
He's still at work.
Okay, at least says he's still at work.
You're trying to rebuild your house on the beach in the middle of the hurricane.
Okay, keep verse 17, the same statement. Flip the page. Verse 21, the same statement. Chapter 10, verse 4, the same statement.
I know it was.
God's angry.
He says, that's not the end of it. It's still more to come.
God's working his thing. But his hand is still reached out still. Because earlier on in the class, a few weeks ago, we talked about we know what a mighty hand, we did this with a mighty hand means he does it with strength. But it seems like Homer Haley said that this is still, that God's still a judging hand, or I could look it up real quick what he said, but I struggle with this verse because some of the commentators seem like they have a really hard time pinpointing what is being said. What does this stretched out hand mean? Does he still have the club to beat his children and discipline them with? I could be completely off base here, but I'm going to throw something out there. I, as God, am rebuking my children. I've given you word, you're doing your thing, you're rebelling. My anger is not done away, but I've still got an outreached hand. Is there any way God is trying to say to these people over and over and over, my anger is not done away because you've not done what I've asked you. You've not come back to you, but I'm still ready for you to.
You're not going to wear God down. He is still going to be there.
There's a twofold justice and judgment, God's righteousness. But he's still got his mercy. Please. He's not doing this for no reason whatsoever. It's not because he's a mean God. It's not because he's a vengeful God. It's not because he's sitting on a throne going, I'm God, I can do it. He wants his people to learn a lesson.
Well, we know he doesn't want anyone to perish. So that's always the message there, I think.
Well, we always say God is love.
God is love. He doesn't want his people to perish. And granted, I didn't get into it. I'm not the Hebrew scholar. Maybe there's something in the wording that makes it that this is a judgment type. This is his chastisement. But as I read it over and over, it's like his anger is not turned away, but his hand is outstretched still. I don't know. So again,
So you think it's more like this instead of like this?
I don't know that it was ever this, where it may have been I got the belt and the stick getting ready to smack you with it.
I'm not an expert on Isaiah either, but I mean, they said they're impenitent. They're still not coming around. They're still stiff-necked. They're still not listening. They're still not repenting. They're still not coming back. And it's almost like, maybe it's like, until you change your heart towards me.
But even in that changing of the heart, what's going to happen?
Then you got the other part. Right.
We see the nature of God. So again, don't hear me saying that I'm some scholar. It could be that I'm still going to beat you senseless until you get it through your thick skull. But when I was reading it just over and over and trying to get, but his hand is still stretched out. He does want his people, so we can't deny that. But whether it's saying that here or not. John, are you wanting to comment?
Yeah, that anger, I believe that's, he's jealous. And the anger comes from his jealousy. And the hand stretched out is wanting his people back.
We definitely cannot dispute God is a jealous God. And that's the whole thing, is he's never, his frustration, his firmness, his discipline, his structure is so that we don't get taken away by Satan. Joan, you start to have a hand and then we'll...
Well, it just always seems to me, it's impossible in God's nature not to deal with sin. He needs to deal with sin, but it's also his nature of love. So it's, his hand reaches out in both capacities. I remember when I first married Howard and he was disciplining his sons, and I was stunned that he would spank them, and as soon as he was done spanking them, he'd pull them onto his lap and hug them. And I just never seen anything like that. To me, that's God. He's going to spank you, but give him a chance and he'll pull you on his lap and hug you.
This is not the first time that he had mentioned about the outstretched hand, though. He did earlier in chapter 5, where he said that the Lord stretched out his hand against them and struck them down. That's about 25. So,
Similar, not the same word. He stretched out his hand to strike them.
yeah.
Again, don't hear me say that it's got to be absolute, but I'm just saying, as I read it, and I told you early on in the class, when I was reading through it, I was trying to read it at face value instead of just going automatically to a book and going, oh, that's what it means. Lee.
And this is by no means, the final word of the matter, but a lot of times in Hebrew writing, they use a technique called parallelism. And there'll be two lines in a row, and both of them will mean the exact same thing, and it will be a restatement or an opposite. And so you can read this either way. But this appears to me to be a restatement of the anger of God. But the figure of this stretched out hand of God, we're told that the creation was a stretching out of God's hand. I hope I don't hit you in the head or something. But it was a stretching out of his hand, and he accomplished a divine work. And so whatever the divine work is, whether it's a positive creative sense or if it is a negative disciplining sense, it's still the handiwork of God. And to me, if you read this as a parallel where they are the same statement, then for all this, his anger has not turned away, therefore his hand is stretched out still is a restatement of his anger.
It's still a disciplining hand.
Still anger. Yeah.
If it's the opposite, it's reaching out. But like you said, in the creation concept, that it is God still going to accomplish his purpose no matter what the case is. Which, hold that thought. God's going to accomplish his purpose. For the people do not turn to him who strikes them. And this could be kind of that parallel, or that, because you read that verse, for the people who do not turn to him who strike them, nor do they seek the Lord of hosts. In the English language, that's like two different people. Could be this is the same. God's the one striking them. They're still not turning to God. Therefore, the Lord will cut off the head from the Israel, or the head and tail from Israel, palm branch and bulrush one day. The elder and the honorable is the head. The prophet who teaches lies, he is the tail. For the teachers or the leaders of this people cause them to err, and those who are led by them are destroyed. Therefore the Lord will have no joy in their young men, nor will have mercy on their fatherless and widows. For everyone is a hypocrite, an evildoer, and every mouth speaks folly. For all of his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. So here we go, God still accomplishing his purpose. What am I going to do? I'm cutting off the head, I'm cutting off the tail. He goes ahead and at least defines what that head and tail are so that we don't have to sit and scratch our heads. But the leaders, he puts the prophets at the tail, but they're the teaching of the lies. Is God only cutting off the head and tail? The entire country is going to become under judgment and punishment. They're all going to be wiped out, all going to be carried away. So it's not just cutting the head and tail, but the point there is, we talk about James 3:1, my brethren, not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. And the concept isn't to run us off from teaching, but to help us to understand the gravity of what we do. I don't know.
Something that's lost in this discussion often for a lot of people that don't fully appreciate God's nature is that they see an angry God when they read this. What they're missing is that this is justice and judgment. And it's not the type of worldly anger and out of control anger. It's very measured.
The justice and judgment, one is in complete alignment with God's nature and character, which he cannot violate that. We don't want to get into the foolish philosophical argument, can God make a rock bigger than he can move? God's not going to violate his true self. But in this justice and in this judgment, the people must realize the same lesson that we must realize today. They brought it upon themselves because they weren't the kind of people that they needed to be with their own brethren, their own arrogance, their own leaving God out of their lives. So it's not, again, that angry God is not here. It's that, as John's saying, this loving God, get your act straight, guys. I want to take care of you. I want to bless you. But you've brought this, it's kind of the parent telling the kid, they're going to hurt me when it hurts you. Lee?
Everyone who died in the flood knew what was right and what was wrong. When Abraham was told that you'll be given this land, but your descendants are going to go away to a land that's not theirs, they're going to spend 400 years, they'll be in captivity, and then they will come out of here because the sin of the Amorite is not yet full. God was working with the Amorites. If you misread and misconstrue the loving kindness, righteousness, and justice of God, you label God as a genocidal maniac because he's wiping out people. And that misunderstanding of God's justice and God's judgment is at play right here too. They're misreading the situation. God is not looking to just wipe these people out.
No.
They got caught with their hand in the cookie jar.
And they've been given ample warning.
Yes, absolutely. And so they should know that what they have done is a transgression. That's why it says that they did not inquire of the Lord. What does that mean? God, please tell us what we've done and what we can do to fix it. What did David do when there was a plague, a pestilence on the land because of his senses? He inquired of the Lord, and he bought that threshing floor, and he began the process of sacrificing tonnage of animals. And he made peace with God. He was corrected.
You threw out there about accepting God to be a genocidal maniac. And today, if we believe, or if you fall into the trap of what the world believes in this loving, tolerant God, he's become a blubbering fool because he's so contradictory. Kind of like our political system. Sorry. So who is the head and the tail, and what is the significance? Paying attention to who are our leaders, or those of us that are in a leadership position, thinking of what the grave responsibility that we have to possibly destroy a nation, to destroy a congregation, to destroy a church, destroy God's people. not take it lightly that we're playing with people's souls. What is the source of their destruction? We've talked about it's God, but they brought it upon themselves, so there's nothing new there. Let's jump into chapter 10. There's a few verses left here in chapter 9. Let's address it quickly. Like I do everything quickly. If I'd been able to come up with a good illustration, I want us to think about, every year we see these fires in the West, out in California and all that. Usually when they have these huge forest fires, what's a lot of times the source or the origination of the fire?
People.
Besides people, okay, I got people, lightning, I can have San Andreas, the winds coming off the mountains. Let's get real simple, get dumb on Craig's level.
Carelessness.
A couple of kids, carelessness, we had a campfire that got out of control. Then think of the destruction, the absolute destruction when we see on the news of thousands upon thousands and 10,000s and hundreds of thousands of acres being wiped out. For wickedness burns as the fire. It should devour the briars and the thorns, kindle the thickets of the forest. They shall mount up like rising smoke through the wrath of the Lord, or through the wrath of the Lord of hosts. The land is burned up, and all the people shall be as fuel for the fire. No man shall spare his brother. And he shall snatch on the right hand and be hungry, and he shall devour on the left hand and not be satisfied. Every man shall eat the flesh of his own arm. Manasseh shall devour Ephraim, and Ephraim Manasseh, and together they shall be against Judah. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out. The imagery, and think about this fire started something stupid, something small, their own wickedness creates something so great that we can equate it to the absolute destruction of everything being annihilated. So much so, almost a civil war where they're turning against each other. The lack of justice, the lack of judgment. Just something that gets carried away when we don't think about it and let it get out of control. In chapter 10, we're not shifting gears. It's still the same thing. As we think about what we just read in 9, verses 13 through 17 about the head and the tail being cut off. Woe to those who decree unrighteous decrees, who write misfortune, which they have prescribed, to rob the needy of justice and take what is right from them, and to take what is right from the poor of my people, that the widows may be their prey, that they may rob the fatherless. What will you do in the day of punishment? And in the desolation will it come from afar? To whom will you flee for help? And where will you leave your glory? Without me they shall bow down among the prisoners, and they shall fall among the slain. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. I know that he's talking about here the leaders writing these decrees that are unrighteous decrees, making ungodly laws, but I couldn't help but just the thought of the scripture that talks about woe to those that call good evil and evil good. Just the concept that we've got to be on guard to make sure that our minds and our hearts and our actions, we're all in alignment, or in alignment with God. That rules and laws aren't just ridiculous or arbitrary, but they actually mean something. There's a purpose for them. But you do see this, and again, what we were talking about a minute ago, Carrie, justice. God can't get away from, he can't get away from himself. He can't get away from who he is. Things need to be done in a decent, orderly way. You take care of people. You take care of your own.
I like in this fourth segment of him holding out his arm that he asked, I think, 3 questions.
Yes.
And the answer to them all is the same. It's God. It's like where should you put your wealth? Well, it should be in God. Or in devastation, who will you flee for help? Well, it should be God. The answer to all those questions.
And he's talking about in verse 3 there, the New King James writes, and where will you leave your glory? And the ESV and others will say, where are you putting your wealth? Where are you putting your stock? But even the question right before that, to whom will you flee for help?
Yeah. Good questions. Questions that they should have been asking themselves and we should ask ourselves.
When we're healthy, we shouldn't even have to ask the question. It should be ingrained. It should be nature. Just dependence upon God. Which goes back to the whole thing here. He's wanted his people. You don't need a king because I'm your king. So you're absolutely right. The question is, who do you look to? We should be looking to God, not just in the help, but when things are great. And they had even missed that. Because if you remember, way back in the beginning when we started this class, they had just gotten over Josiah, which was one of the most prosperous times in their history. And in their prosperity, they were forgetting to do what God's asked them to do. Taking care of their other brothers and sisters. So they're not worshiping God in prosperity. They're not taking care of the poor. They're not taking care of the fatherless. They're not taking care of the widows. They're living for themselves and they're taking advantage of others and heaping up great treasures. And God humbles them. So you're right. The questions are obvious and we need to be thinking about them daily. Anyone other thoughts at that point? Oh, Joanne.
Well, I was thinking, this just takes me full circle back to Leviticus 26, because God is a promise-keeping God. And in Leviticus 26, he promises, if you do these things, then this is how I will bless you. But if you disobey, this is what I'll do. And so he lays it out for them. If they could just go back and review Leviticus 26, they will know why they're being punished. And, and it's, again, just a matter of, instead of being hard-hearted, turning back and repenting.
And even in the new covenant, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. I mean, it's really, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. We're the ones that make it difficult when we let our heads get in the way and we let all the chatter and the noise. But it's very simple. Once you set your mind to it, to follow God is not a difficult task. But you're absolutely right. When I put that in, that's when I was going to talk about that outstretched hand. We've talked a lot about that, and I think we all have a good understanding going on there. Chapter 10, as I read through this, I couldn't help but, in verses 5 and following, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I will send him against an ungodly nation, and against my people in wrath I will give him charge to seize the spoil, to take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Yet he does not mean so, nor does his heart think so, but in his heart to destroy and cut off a few nations. For he says, are not my princes altogether kings? Is not Calno like Carmesh? Forgive me on all these. Let's skip over to verse 10. As my hand has found the kingdoms of the idols, whose carved images excel those of Jerusalem and Samaria, as I have done to Samaria and her idols, shall I not also do to Jerusalem and her idols? It was hard this and through the rest of the chapter, or at least down through verse 19. These two thoughts are hard for me, but we see it in God's character. God has chosen Assyria to come in to discipline his people. Lee, you've made plenty of comments. It's hard for us to sometimes wrap our heads around how can God use such an ungodly country to discipline his chosen people. But as we go through, if we drop down to verse 13, where he says, by my strength of my hand I have done it. Well, let's actually, I can't go there. 12. Therefore it shall come to pass when the Lord has performed all his works on Mount Zion and Jerusalem that he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the glory for his haughty looks. For he says, by my strength of hand I have done it, and by my wisdom I am prudent. Also, I have removed the boundaries of the people. It's hard to wrap our heads around. God chose Assyria to punish his people, but now he's going to turn around and punish Assyria because they're so arrogant. I'll let you comment. You're the next person. There's a lesson here in my mind. Well, let me ask you a question. Did Assyria, we don't know how they were chosen. We don't know if the king woke up one day and said, I'm going to go to war. We don't know if it was a dream or a vision, do we? We're not given any indication of how God tapped them on the shoulder and said. So the question would be, what indication or how do we know that they knew that they were on a mission from God? God chose them because he had something that needed to happen with his people.
I don't think they knew they were on a mission. It doesn't say that.
We're not told that. And I see this hand waving, so I got to get there fast. One, I have to accept that everything's not recorded. But for God to come back and punish them for their arrogance, he had an expectation out of Assyria to still acknowledge and know who he was, or to understand that they were a tool being used by him. In my mind, God would not. My thoughts, I can't speak on behalf of God, but the just God, how would he punish a country for being arrogant and thinking it was them when he's wanting them to give him the credit and glory? There must have been something going on. In my mind, God expects all people worldwide, whether Jews, Hebrews, Christians, U.S. citizens, or in the darkest continent of Africa, God still expects. We see it throughout the Old Testament with Nebuchadnezzar. We see it with different countries or different Melchizedek. God still expected people outside of his people to know him. And there's always been the opportunity for them to come to him. It's never been a closed society. Are you following any of my thought here? Am I making any sense? Well, you had a comment. Maybe you can rescue me.
One day there was a fellow that showed up in Nineveh, a short time after he was vomited out of the mouth of a big fish, and he preached Almighty God to these people, and they repented.
And they weren't God's people.
God communicated to Assyria.
Somehow.
He communicated to Assyria very clearly, and they turned to God, and then in their arrogance they turned away from him. Now, at what point they became an instrument in the hand of God is unclear, but the point remains that they could have been a righteous nation used as an instrument in the hand of God, and they opted to turn away from God. God still used them, but he righteously and justly punished them because they too turned away from him. It's interesting that if you read the list of nations that God used to judge other nations, you've got Babylon, and you've got Assyria, you've got Judah and Egypt, and and the Romans. All of them were judged, but Cyrus the Mede pops in the middle of all of that, and he's the one that allowed the people to return to Jerusalem, and he was not judged. His successors, when the Persians got a little arrogant, they were judged by the Macedonian Greeks. But all of those in that ebb and flow of history, Cyrus kind of stands out as the only one. And the Medes turned out to be the only one that didn't turn against God.
They were sympathetic and understood the plea, go back to rebuild.
Yes. But every other one, they had an opportunity, and they chose not to stay with God.
So we don't know what was said or how God chose the Assyrians. But it would make sense. It's logical. But God expects all mankind. We don't need to get wrapped up in that other argument about, well, they've never heard. I don't believe that. The message has been taught throughout history. But when you go through this and you really read chapters, not 10, and you go down through 13 and following, God is, listen to this. 14, my hand has found like a nest the riches of the people, and one gathers eggs are left. I have gathered all the earth. This is the arrogance. This is what Assyria is saying. And God's just blown away. Do you not see me? Do you not know what I've done? Verse 15, shall the axe boast against itself against he who chops with it? Or shall the saw exalt itself against he who saws with it? As if a rod could wield itself against those who lift it up, or as if a staff could lift it up or lift up as if it were not wood? Could this stick just jump up? It's wood. It can't do anything without somebody picking it up, and I'm the somebody. Therefore the Lord of hosts, will send leanness among his fat ones. In this one, it's a little h, his fat ones. But what are the other translations? Anything say there? I was in verse 16. Therefore the Lord of hosts, will send leanness among his fat ones. They all say about the same thing?
When God's done with the stick, he's going to throw it in the fire. It's really that's what it says to me. When God is done with Assyria, then Assyria is going to implode.
Well, later on in the verse, and under his glory he will kindle a burning like a burning fire. Right, God is going to punish them because they neglected to see him. But my point that I was trying to make in that little comment there, he will send leanness among his fat ones.
Among
his
Assyrians.
Among the Assyrians, but he still uses the terminology, they're his.
Well, so you're thinking the word his means they're God's.
In the same open, very generic, not generic, I don't like that word. Not his people like Israel, but it's not those, they're still his. All of creation is his. He's not trying to, he's still in control. He still expects to be revered as God. Little things like that pop out to me sometimes as he goes through. So the light of Israel will be for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame. It will burn and devour his thorns and his briars in the day, and it will consume the glory of the forest of his fruitful field, both soul and body. He's not going to be, he lays it out. There is no saving Assyria. They're going to be utterly wiped out. And we know how history goes, as Lee's pointed out. Country after country comes in, but they're wiped out. We're getting close on time. But at the end, the last part of, after all of this, and we're going to finish 10 tonight, no matter what, in 3 minutes. There's a remnant. God always has a remnant. There's always a thread of God's people. Now, as he comes through Assyria, I'm using you. You come in, you're arrogant, but I'm going to destroy you too. And it shall come to pass in that day, what day? When they're destroyed, that the remnant comes back. And such have escaped the house of Jacob will never again depend on him who defeated them, but will depend on the Lord. Remnant, those that survive are what? Those that depend on the Lord. That question you asked a minute ago, Carrie? Who will you turn to? Turn to the Lord. But will depend on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. The remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people, O Israel, be as the sand of the sea. There's so many of them, but it's going to be a remnant. The destruction decrees shall overflow with righteousness, for the Lord God of hosts will make a determined end in the midst of the land. And then, what's strange is it follows out the last part of the chapter. Therefore, the Lord, says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrian. He will strike you with a rod and lift up his staff against you in the manner of Egypt. For yet a little while, and the indignation will cease, as will my anger in their destruction. Can you imagine? And as I was reading this, they've been told, they've been given the word over and 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 over how bad it's going to be. This country's going to come in and wipe you out, or have battles, wars, your people are going to be killed. I'm going to destroy them out of their arrogance. There's going to be a little bit of you left. But still the comfort of, don't fear them. Still dependence upon me. It's only going to be a little while. That's a hard lesson to think about. With all of the anger, all of the frustration, all of the rebuke, all of the correction, all of everything that's going on. And remember, way back in the beginning of this class, the Assyrians were not. We're talking about, remember I talked about having a tower lined with human flesh? They would peel the skin off people. But don't fear. That's a hard lesson, but that's a lesson we've got to know too. It's only a little while. We're only here for a few years. No matter how bad it is, don't fear. So we see God's justice. We see the equality of people. We see trust me. I want to discipline you, but I want you to come back. I mean, there are so many lessons in this book, in these 10 chapters that God's trying to say, if you'll be my people, I'll be your God. Thoughts, questions? We're over a minute or two. Thank you guys. You'll have a great evening.